Hey guys, tonight we slip through a cracked wooden door into the choking hush of a cramped, half-lit room. A stew pot simmers over dying coals. The smell is faintly sweet, maybe turnips, maybe meat. A young settler sits cross-legged on the dirt floor, hands clasped in prayer or paralysis. He doesn't eat. No one in the room does. Outside, the wind gnaws at the shutters. Inside, they are surrounded by food they no longer trust, no longer know how to touch. Welcome to the colonies, where death came not just from scarcity, but from something stranger. If this story helped your brain take a nap, go ahead and tap like, maybe even subscribe. If you're feeling wild, it's free, no pressure. Let me know where you're watching from and what time it is there. Always love hearing who's tuning in. Now breathe, get cozy, and let's wander into a time when dinner could kill you. You trudge across a brittle Virginia path, the forest brittle with late November cold. Dry leaves crumple beneath your boots. The sun is too low, the air too still, and something is wrong. You pass a barrel stacked in a row, lidless and half-rotten, filled with grain swollen and gray. Maggots ripple on the surface like slow-moving porridge. You cover your mouth. This was supposed to be supper. This was all the supper. Let's break the illusion. The early American colonists weren't starving because they had nothing. They were starving with cellars full of weevil-ridden flour, meat cured wrong, and crates of seeds no one had planted. The scene wasn't scarcity. It was incompetence soaked in hubris. Picture it. A ship docks with weeks of provisions, salted pork, beans, ale, flour. By the time it's offloaded and unpacked, the pork stinks, the beans are riddled with mold, and the flour was stored next to lamp oil. This is the part where your history class quietly skipped ahead, because nobody likes to talk about how a group of supposedly brave settlers, people handpicked to survive the New World, essentially tripped over their own dinner. The mystery is not why they were hungry. The mystery is how they managed it while surrounded by abundance. Let's sit for a second with that stew again. The one from the opening, because that's real. In the winter of 1609 to 1610, during what came to be called the starving time in Jamestown, colonists did have pots. They had roots and bones and dried herbs. Some even had stored venison or river clams. But by then, the fear had seeped into every corner of the colony. Fear of disease, of poison, of theft. People stopped sharing meals. Some stopped eating altogether. Not because there was nothing left, but because they no longer knew what could be eaten. Historians still argue whether it was psychological collapse, disease paranoia, or just pure panic that caused food to sit untouched. But this much is known. As bodies piled up, storerooms were not always empty. They were just closed. The man appointed to ration meals, George Percy, wrote in haunted prose about those who ate vermin and corpses, but also admitted that some of the best stores were locked away, controlled by a select few. Let that sink in. People literally starved outside rooms full of sacks and barrels. And there's something tragic, and frankly absurd, in how familiar that feels. Like a modern fridge full of expired yogurt and mysterious leftovers, while you declare, there's nothing to eat. Here's a fringe tidbit you won't find in textbooks. One early settler tried to make beer out of acorns and bark. The resulting sludge was described as bitter, black, and best avoided unless already drunk. That guy later went blind. Coincidence? Maybe. Or maybe just a recipe for disappointment. But back to the bigger picture. The early colonies were founded by people who underestimated everything. The climate, the soil, the wildlife, each other, and most fatally, themselves. They expected to arrive, build a few fences, maybe charm the local tribes, and eat like kings. Instead, they found chaos. One colonist wrote that they couldn't tell which berries were safe, so they just didn't eat berries at all. Others feared the river fish because they looked wrong. Trout was slippery and suspicious. I mean, same honestly. It's like giving a toddler a stocked pantry and expecting a souffle. And still, there were moments of hope. Times when one group figured out how to trap eels, or when a friendly Powhatan woman dropped off baskets of maize under cover of fog. But those flickers of salvation were short-lived, often sabotaged by pride, politics, or good old-fashioned ignorance. Remember that young settler with the stew? He wasn't alone. In some records, groups sat around cooking pots, but only the bravest would taste. By the end of winter, it was less about eating and more about waiting for a rescue ship, for spring, for something to shift. And here's the cruelest twist. Some of them survived. They limped through, half mad and hollow, ready to rebuild and repeat many of the same mistakes, because they still didn't fully understand why they had starved. They blamed the natives, the rain, the stars, but very few blamed the fact that they had full plates and chose not to eat. You drag your hand along the rim of a cracked wooden barrel. Inside, dry soil clumps like stale cake. This was meant to be a garden. Instead, it's a grave for a dozen English hopes. The seeds? Still good. The dirt? Not terrible. The colonists? Absolutely, hilariously unqualified. Let's be blunt. The early settlers didn't just fail to grow food, they failed to understand how food worked. They packed sacks of seeds they didn't know how to plant, tools they didn't know how to use, and dreams of cornucopias they thought would just show up. The American soil wasn't the issue, the attitude was. Imagine arriving in a strange land and thinking, ah yes, time to plant English peas. Never mind that the local tribes were cultivating maize, squash, and beans in perfect balance. Never mind that the seasons were different, the pests were different, the entire planet was different. Nope. They stuck to what they knew, or thought they knew, and blamed the soil when their crops failed. There's a popular story of one early colonial leader who insisted they grow wheat, a European staple, despite being warned it wouldn't thrive in coastal Virginia. By July, the wheat was wilted, the colonists were confused, and the local tribes were deeply unimpressed. Here's the fringe tidbit. Some of the settlers actually buried their seeds too deep, thinking more dirt equals more protection. What they got instead was rot. Just imagine a settler muttering, "Why won't my carrots grow?" while standing over a 14-inch deep seed trench. Because, carrots famously love spelunking. And this wasn't just a one-time mistake. It became a pattern. Fail, blame, repeat. When harvest didn't come, colonists assumed divine punishment, or sabotage, or perhaps that someone had cursed their cabbage. They rarely suspected it was because they were trying to grow barley in the shade of a pine swamp. Historians still argue whether the settlers truly refused to learn indigenous techniques, or whether they were simply too proud to ask. But the result was the same: acres of wasted land in a community that couldn't feed itself even when surrounded by green. There's a chilling diary entry from 1623 where a settler writes, "We digged much, yet naught did grow." That's it. No reflection, no context, just the slow heartbreak of watching time slip by while the earth refuses to answer. And yet, help was all around them. The indigenous peoples of the region had mastered the land for centuries, cultivating crops with a method we now call the Three Sisters: maize, beans, and squash planted together, helping each other grow like best friends at a garden party. The beans fix nitrogen, the maize provides support, and the squash shades the weeds. It's elegant, simple, and, to the colonists, basically witchcraft. Instead of embracing this genius, settlers often mocked it. One early journal scoffed at the savages' jumbled crops, not realizing they were describing one of the most effective permaculture systems in agricultural history. And even when a tribe generously offered to teach them, or, more often, just gave them food, it was treated as charity, not wisdom. The knowledge was rarely recorded, rarely passed down. One governor literally traded away a canoe full of squash seeds for a barrel of nails. And when those temporary lifelines vanished, after misunderstandings, insults, or outright violence, the colonists were left staring at tilled soil that refused to yield. Let's pause and picture it. The sun's blazing down, the fields are bare, and a settler named Edmund is shouting at the ground because nothing sprouteth. Meanwhile, a mile away, a Powhatan family harvests sweet corn taller than a man. One colonist reportedly tried to grow lettuce using salt water, thinking the sea must have its own nourishment. The crop did not thank him. He later turned his garden into a latrine. Honestly, it was probably an improvement. And here's the core of it. These people weren't lazy. They were just profoundly misinformed, trained in a different world. Many of them were craftsmen, minor nobles, merchants, skilled in areas that had nothing to do with survival. They could forge a horseshoe or calculate a ledger, but ask them to plant beans? Blank stares all around. By the time desperation set in, it was too late to learn. The soil had hardened, the sun had changed its angle, and pride had sunk its claws in. They tried growing European turnips in North Carolina sand. They tried digging trenches for rainwater in drought-prone areas. One group even tried blessing their crops with prayers instead of manure. Guess how well that worked. Meanwhile, stories floated back to England about savage fields and untamable lands, conveniently skipping the part where the colonists had ignored every local farming method out of arrogance. And if you're thinking, well, at least they learned eventually, you're partially right. A few did, slowly. But most of those who really figured it out, those who asked, adapted, and humbled themselves, weren't the ones in charge. The people who knew how to grow food quietly fed others, often without credit, and the ones shouting orders were still waiting for tomatoes to grow on trees. There's a strange comfort in that, actually. A reminder that survival doesn't favor the loud or the proud. It favors the flexible. So the next time your sourdough fails, remember, at least you didn't plant it in a swamp. You sit on the edge of a crude dock, watching as another boatload of settlers stumbles ashore. The air smells like brine and wet wool. A man in silk stockings yells at a servant to fetch his luggage. Another stares at the trees like they might attack him. None of them are carrying shovels. The third wave of colonists has arrived, and once again, they've sent gentlemen. If you've ever shown up to a group project only to discover that everyone else is just here to supervise, you already understand early colonial logistics. The ships that brought England's hopes to the New World weren't stacked with blacksmiths, farmers, or survivalists. No, they were stacked with second sons of noblemen, dreamers chasing gold, and a few unlucky artisans who'd been promised light work and adventure. Spoiler, there was no gold, and the only adventure was starvation. The Virginia Company, who organized these expeditions, was less concerned with long-term success and more concerned with quick profit. That meant they handpicked settlers not for what they could do, but for what they owned. Wealthy investors? Welcome aboard. Gardeners? Please wait by the dock. This led to the delightful early colonial workforce balance of about 12 blacksmiths and 60 men who brought fencing swords. Historians still argue whether the company truly misunderstood the colony's needs, or simply didn't care. After all, shareholders back in London weren't the ones eating boiled shoe leather. Here's a fringe tidbit that sums it up. One settler brought a falcon, yes, a bird, for sport. It died within a week, possibly from shock. The man wept and tried to hold a funeral. Meanwhile, someone behind him was literally eating bark. You can almost picture the scene. A man in a velvet coat stands beside a field, gesturing vaguely at a laborer. You there. Plant something. Potatoes, perhaps. Never mind that potatoes weren't even common in England yet, or that this man couldn't tell a potato from a rock, or that he had brought no seeds. The class divide was a quiet killer. Gentlemen refused to work the land, considering it beneath them. Laborers were overworked, underfed, and often blamed when crops failed. There are letters home that mention insubordination, which in context usually meant the cook collapsed from hunger again. And when power struggles broke out, it wasn't over how to grow food. It was over who got the last bottle of wine. A colony run by egos rather than experience. Imagine a boardroom meeting held in a swamp. One of the more comically tragic figures was a man named Captain John Martin. A nobleman with a short temper and a strong belief in his own genius, Martin refused to follow local advice, insisted on growing crops near brackish water, and once tried to have a man executed for eating a wild pear without permission. That pear was the most nutrition anyone in his camp had seen in 3 days. Even those who wanted to help were often ill-equipped. A silversmith tried to build a plow. It broke. A tailor offered to stitch grain sacks but had no fabric. A preacher gave daily sermons about self-sufficiency and then fainted from hunger during one. What's astonishing is how often these colonies repeated the same mistakes. Jamestown, Roanoke, Popham, different names, same story. More hats than hoes, more muskets than milk cows. The logic seemed to be, If we just bring more people, surely it'll work. But they kept bringing more of the wrong people. It was like trying to build IKEA furniture with poets. Here's a little known fact. There was a formal job title in some colonies called gentleman adventurer. That was a real position. Duties included walking around, making suggestions, and getting frostbite. Even Captain John Smith, one of the few leaders with any practical skills, complained bitterly in his journals about the idle gentleman who refused to contribute. At one point, he threatened to whip anyone who didn't help plant corn. It worked, briefly, until the men realized corn required weeding. And yet, amid all this absurdity, life staggered on. A carpenter fixed a wheelbarrow. A butcher found a way to smoke meat over a pit. A young woman taught others how to cook corn into cakes. These quiet moments of competence flickered in the background, barely noticed. They weren't the ones giving orders, but they were the reason anything survived. Imagine it. The colony half collapsed, food stores dwindling, leadership fighting over dinner seating. And in the corner, someone's quietly learning how to trap rabbits. Those were the real heroes, not the sword polishers and falconers. The irony, when ships returned to England with reports of starvation, the company responded not with practical tools or farmhands, but with another round of investors, another crowd of city boys with dreams of silver mines and fur coats. By the time the colony started to stabilize, years had passed, and not because they'd figured out some great new method, but because they finally sent the right people. Farmers, blacksmiths, women, children, people who weren't looking for gold, but for a place to grow tomatoes and stay alive. So next time someone tells you colonization was a triumph of the brave and capable, remember, the first few years were more Monty Python than myth, a whole continent teeming with food, and the colonists brought bird cages and poetry books. You lift the lid on a barrel, the smell hits like a fist, it's meat, or was. Salt crystals crust the top like a desperate disguise, but beneath, the pork has turned an angry green. Welcome to colonial refrigeration. 1 part guesswork, 1 part prayer, 0 actual cold. Here's the hard truth. The settlers had food. They just couldn't keep it from killing them. From the moment a supply ship docked, the countdown began. Everything they brought, flour, salted fish, cheese, ale, started a slow, hot death march the second it hit American air. No fridges, no preservatives besides salt, and nothing like the tight-sealed tins we think of today. A barrel of beef might arrive intact, but open it 3 weeks later and you might find something unholy growing teeth. They tried, bless them, but preservation methods were old, inconsistent, and often sabotaged by the journey itself. Salt pork was a staple, but only if packed correctly. Otherwise, it turned to mush in transit. Dried beans got soggy in damp holds. Cheese melted, rats partied, and some unlucky ships carried cargoes soaked in seawater from leaks no one noticed until the food hissed when opened. One captain wrote home that a full third of his cargo was lost to the worms. Not metaphorical ones, actual worms, crawling, thriving, and very, very well fed. Historians still argue whether this was due more to shipping practices or climate ignorance. Probably both. England's food storage systems simply weren't built for the wild humidity of the American coast. What stayed dry in a London cellar turned to soup in Chesapeake heat. Here's a delightful fringe detail. Some barrels were packed with brandy pickled eggs. A brilliant sounding idea until they exploded. Turns out fermenting alcohol and spoiled yolks don't mix. One barrel reportedly popped on shore, splattering 3 gentlemen and causing a full hour of screaming. The colony priest declared it an omen. The cook declared it Tuesday. But even when supplies arrived in good condition, the way they were handled often sealed their doom. Colonists would leave flour barrels open in kitchens swarming with flies. They'd store fish in sheds too damp for even mold to grow properly. One settler thought it was a good idea to hang hams in a sunlit attic. They melted. He called it pork gravy. The others called it a crime. You can imagine the pattern. A ship docks with life-saving provisions. People cheer. A week later, the bread is green, the beer is sour, and the butter tastes like soap. And somehow, nobody learns. And when things went bad, which they always did, There was a second, subtler danger: shame. Admitting that your supplies had spoiled meant admitting you'd failed, and pride was thick in these camps, so people pretended they cooked the pork anyway, ate around the blue bits, watered the ale. One poor fellow insisted the bread was just extra hearty. He died 3 days later, possibly of optimism. And no, it wasn't just one colony. This was a pattern. Popham, Roanoke, even parts of Plymouth, spoiled supplies, followed by hunger, followed by death. One settlement reportedly burned half their stores after rats moved in, before realizing it had been their only flour. The rats presumably lived to gloat another day. Now, let's talk packaging. Barrels were the go-to, but barrels were finicky. If the wood warped during the sea voyage, and it often did, the seams leaked, salt washed out, moisture seeped in. What should have been 200 pounds of preserved meat turned into a soggy horror. And that's assuming the barrels were packed by someone who cared. Spoiler, some were packed by folks who'd never seen America and didn't plan to. They were paid to fill barrels, not ensure survival. So shortcuts happened: thin salt layers, unwashed hands, no lids. One merchant famously shipped peas, so dried they must be hammered to split. Another sent biscuits stored beside lamp oil. Surprise! The biscuits tasted like kerosene. Several people ate them anyway. One man called it bracing. He later ate his shoe. And what about cold storage? Ha! Even winter wasn't a guarantee. Colonists tried to bury meat underground, but forgot about wild dogs. They suspended food in trees, but squirrels are ambitious. One group even tried ice cellars, only to discover that Virginia ice doesn't last past breakfast. The result? Cellars with full stores and empty bellies. Food was there, but it was a gamble every time. Eat the cheese and hope it doesn't bite back. Drink the beer and pray it wasn't made with river water. Stew the meat until the mold comes off. It sounds like a comedy of errors, and in some ways, it was. But the consequences were devastating, because once food spoiled, there was no backup. You couldn't order more. You couldn't whip up an emergency garden. You just waited. Waited for another ship, for another storm to scatter it, for another week to pass while the smell got worse. And if you were lucky, you gotta boil it anyway and call it strongly seasoned. If you weren't lucky, well, you got remembered as the one who tried to eat the soap barrel. So next time your grocery delivery goes missing, take heart. At least your dinner didn't scream when you opened it. You step outside the palisade, musket over your shoulder, stomach growling loud enough to scare birds. You're not hunting for deer, too fast, or turkey, too clever. No, today you're aiming your sights at something more manageable. A squirrel. Maybe two, if you're lucky. The forest is teeming with life. Fat fish wriggle in the creeks. Wild herbs blanket the ground. Nuts crunch underfoot. But to the colonists, most of it is invisible. Or worse, suspicious. They shot what they knew, avoided what they didn't, and often overlooked the fact that nature was literally throwing food at their feet. Let's be honest, the early colonists were terrible hunters, and not just in a miss-the-shot kind of way, more like a shot at a raccoon and blamed it for dodging kind of way. These were people trained in fox hunts and boar chases, not the quiet patience required to stalk unfamiliar prey. The local ecosystem was a mystery, and instead of studying it, they panicked and aimed at anything with legs. Squirrels, for example, were common targets, not because they were nutritious, but because they were easy. One settler proudly wrote home that he'd bagged 4 fat tails. Never mind that a squirrel provides about as much meat as a chicken nugget, and that nugget came with parasites. Meanwhile, entire schools of fish shimmered in rivers just yards away, untouched. The colonists feared them. Their eyes are strange, one diary says. Another calls them serpents of the water. Trout, eels, perch, all dismissed because they looked unfamiliar. One man reportedly called catfish the devil's mustache. He died not from fish, but from stubbornness. Historians still argue whether this aversion came from superstition, ignorance, or just sheer culinary snobbery. Probably all three. Fish was considered poor man's food in many parts of England. Game was prestigious, so they chased deer through thickets and tripped over actual baskets of river crabs. Here's a fringe gem for you. Some colonists thought shellfish were poisonous because of their shape. Clams resemble unclean things, one reverend wrote, which tells us more about him than the clams. Another settler was horrified to discover oysters could be eaten raw. The taste was like kissing Neptune, he said, not a compliment. But it wasn't just aquatic bounty that was missed. The woods were packed with edible plants, ramps, wild onions, berries, even wild asparagus. Native tribes used them for centuries. The colonists, they saw weeds, or worse, heathen leaves, because if it wasn't in an English garden, it couldn't be good. One account tells of a settler who yanked up an entire patch of wild mint because he thought it smelled suspicious. Later, his wife brewed tea from it anyway. It was the best thing they drank all winter. Meanwhile, the local tribes were out foraging daily. Their knowledge was encyclopedic. They could tell a poisonous berry from a medicinal one at a glance. They knew which roots were edible, which bark could be brewed into tea, and which mushrooms were just asking to kill you. But instead of learning, the colonists mostly stared, nodded, and went back to roasting rats. And speaking of mushrooms, yes, they're part of the story. The colonists avoided them almost entirely. Untrustworthy fungus, one journal entry sneers. They called mushrooms toadstools, a term already dripping with doom. Ironically, the few who did try wild mushrooms sometimes picked the wrong kind and got violently sick, which only reinforced the paranoia. Thus began the grand colonial tradition of, if it's squishy, don't touch it. Let's not forget the time a settler tried to catch a raccoon using salted meat in a net. The raccoon stole the net. The man cried. Or the group that went on a 6-hour hunt and returned with a single possum, which no one wanted to cook. They stared at it until it began to smell, then buried it with full honors. But every now and then, someone got it right. A teenage boy learned to snare rabbits from watching a tribal child. A woman discovered you could stew pine needles for vitamin C. Someone figured out how to make bread from crushed acorns after soaking them for days. Quiet victories hidden under the noise of louder failures. The truth is, there was a buffet waiting, but only for those willing to admit they didn't know what they were doing. And the early colonists, they were not great at admitting things. So while food skittered, swam, fluttered, and rooted itself all around them, many colonists kept eating stale rations and dreaming of English pies. They hunted for prestige, not calories. They ignored the rivers. They feared the forest. And when famine came knocking, they looked around and said, "But there's nothing to eat." To which the forest might have replied, "Dude, I'm right here." You sit near the fire, staring into a pot that bubbles suspiciously. The smell is complex, somewhere between wood smoke, sour broth, and something faintly barnyard. Everyone else in the circle looks just as uncertain. A boot sole floats to the surface. Someone stirs it back under. Welcome to colonial cuisine, the era of desperation dinners. This was the age of we'll try anything once. Squirrels didn't work, try the bark. Ran out of flour, maybe grind bones. Out of oil? Let's see what bear fat tastes like. Spoiler, bear fat tastes like you're being haunted by bacon. The infamous starving time of 1609 to 1610 in Jamestown didn't just reduce people to eating rats and snakes, it rewrote the entire concept of food. Anything that wasn't nailed down, and some things that were, went into the pot. One colonist boiled his gloves, another roasted his belt. Leather, when soaked long enough and stewed with herbs, if you had them, could resemble food, if you ignored the fact that it tasted like a medieval saddlebag. And yet, they kept eating, not because it was nourishing, but because it was something warm. Let's talk about the bread. There wasn't much, but when there was, it fought back. Without yeast or proper grain, colonists got creative. Acorn flour, pulverized bark, crushed corn, sometimes cooked without water. The result was usually flat, dense, and bitter, like a mood, baked. One account describes bread so hard it had to be soaked in water for hours just to cut it. Another settler wrote that his loaf clove my molar in twain. Honestly, that sounds like something from a Viking saga. And still, they ate. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some colonists tried to make jam from wild berries and honey. Sounds lovely, right? except they boiled it for too long and turned it into something akin to stained glass. One child reportedly broke a tooth on it. The jar was later used as a window pane, 2 uses, 0 calories. And then there were the creative stews, a blend of whatever could be scraped, chopped, or vaguely rehydrated. Roots, shoe leather, bird bones, pine needles, the occasional worm. If it fit in the pot, it went in. If it floated, it was considered a delicacy. Historians still argue whether these meals were the result of survival genius or just pure culinary panic. Probably both. On one hand, they were adapting. On the other, they were boiling candle wax for flavor. You decide. Let's not forget the acorn incident. Acorns are technically edible if you process them right. They're full of tannins which make them bitter and mildly toxic. Indigenous tribes knew how to soak and dry them to make flour. The colonists did not, so they just crushed raw acorns and baked the result. The outcome? A biscuit that tasted like tree bark and acted like a digestive grenade. Several colonists fell ill. One man claimed he saw angels. Another just vomited for 3 days straight and kept insisting it was worth trying again. Even things that could be food were often ruined in the making. Without good pots, people cooked in whatever they could find. Copper, lead-lined pans, old buckets, toxins leached in. People got sick, and still it was better than eating nothing. And then there's the leather. Leather stew. Imagine a boot boiled for 9 hours. Then imagine drinking the water it made. That was Tuesday dinner. They boiled harness straps, sword sheaths, book covers. One group even tried stewing the soles off their own shoes, only to discover they were stuffed with moss for insulation. That moss became soup garnish, probably not gluten-free. Every day was a gamble. And don't get too excited about meat. Even when they had some, it was often half-rotten. A salted fish might arrive green at the edges. A hunk of beef might be crawling. And if someone gifted you something suspiciously fresh, you had to ask yourself, what was that animal yesterday? Which brings us, reluctantly, to the more whispered meals. Desperation ran deep. You've likely heard about it, the rumors, the skeletons, the confessions written in tight, ashamed ink. Yes, some colonists, during the very worst of it, resorted to cannibalism. But that horror belongs in a later section. For now, just know, when food ran out, the line between sustenance and survival blurred like soup in a storm. What's strangely moving about all this is how hard people tried to pretend things were normal. They sat at tables, they said grace, they chewed leather and called it jerky, they toasted with acorn mash and whispered that spring would come. One man carved a fork out of pine just to feel civilized while eating squirrel meat. Another woman folded a cloth napkin before sipping birch bark tea. It's heartbreaking and almost noble. Starving, sick, and terrified, but still clinging to dinner manners. Because that's what food was. Not just survival, but ritual. A reminder of the lives they'd left behind. The stews weren't just stew. They were hope, in a bowl, even when the bowl was made from half a broken helmet. So, yes, they ate the unthinkable, but they also imagined the edible. And in a way, that might have kept them going longer than anything else. You crouch low behind the stockade, hands trembling. Across the clearing, a figure disappears into the trees, leaving behind a basket, maize, squash, maybe beans. You don't chase them. You don't shout thanks. You wait until they're gone. Then you take the basket and pretend no one saw you rely on someone else. This was the paradox the colonists could have learned. The wisdom was offered gently, generously, and then, just as quickly, it was lost. The early settlers weren't alone. They were surrounded by people who understood the land with a depth that bordered on poetry. The Powhatan, the Wampanoag, the Abenaki. These weren't just neighbors. They were walking encyclopedias of ecology, agriculture, and seasonal knowledge, and for a brief window, many of them shared it. But the colonists didn't know how to accept a gift without assuming it was a trade, or a trap. The earliest arrivals were, for the most part, treated with a wary curiosity. Indigenous peoples brought corn, fish, squash, not as tribute, but as outreach. They showed how to plant the Three Sisters, how to make hominy, how to dry meat without losing flavor. One Wampanoag elder even taught a group how to use fish guts as fertilizer, a tip that, in modern terms, was basically the difference between survival and collapse. Historians still argue whether this generosity was strategic diplomacy or simple compassion. Probably both, but either way, it wasn't returned in kind. Here's the bitter twist. At first, the colonists were willing to learn. Hungry people don't ask too many questions. But once the famine passed, even briefly, pride returned like a fog. Suddenly, planting savage corn felt beneath them. Eating squash felt foreign, too orange, too soft. Here's a strange fringe anecdote. One settler reported throwing away an entire stockpile of indigenous donated beans because the colony's governor declared them ill-shaped. That winter, the same man wrote about eating boiled leather. Full circle. And then came the real fracture: violence. Colonial expansion, land hunger, and misunderstandings boiled into outright conflict. Once friendly tribes were accused of stealing, threatening, lurking. Skirmishes broke out. Promises were broken. Treaties ignored. Suddenly, the man who had taught you to catch trout was now labeled an enemy. The woman who had brought baskets of squash was now a witch. The worst part? The knowledge went with them. Many tribes withdrew, quietly, some out of grief, some out of rage, some simply because they realized what kind of neighbors they now had, and with them went 1,000 years of lived local experience. It wasn't just seeds the colonists lost, it was context. They forgot when to plant, where to dig, what to store, which mushrooms won't melt your liver. And perhaps worst of all, they forgot to ask. There's a letter from 1611 written in the thinnest ink, where a colonist pleads for help from the friendly ones across the river. No names, no explanation, just a quiet, desperate hope that maybe someone would come teach them again. No one did. You can imagine the silence that followed. No more baskets, no more hands held over furrows to show depth, just wind and hunger. And yet, despite it all, small remnants remained. Some colonists had learned. Not the loud ones, not the leaders, but the cooks, the children, the widows. They remembered how to bury fish near corn, how to harvest nuts, how to dry berries on flat rocks. They whispered these things like secrets, not knowing how close they were to extinction themselves. Because once the trust was broken, the learning stopped. And the food vanished right behind it. There's something tragic in that. Not just the loss of nutrition, but the loss of a relationship. The land was never silent, but without its interpreters, the colonists wandered through it like ghosts, deaf to everything that could have saved them. Take the story of Thomasine Hall, a quiet, sharp-eyed settler who learned from a local woman how to identify edible moss. When the woman was driven out of the colony, Thomasine kept eating it, quietly, secretly. Years later, when another settler fell sick from bad mushrooms, Thomasine tried to teach the difference. No one listened. Too many settlers equated asking for help with weakness. They thought survival came from force, from fences, from holding power. But survival, especially in this strange, harsh new world, came from humility. From asking, "What do you know that I don't?" But the colonists stopped asking, first out of pride, then out of fear, then, finally, because there was no one left to answer. And so they stumbled forward, half-fed and half-willing, until starvation taught the lessons they'd refused to learn gently. So next time someone tells you that the colonies were carved from wilderness by grit alone, remember the hands that tried to guide them, and the voices that were silenced before the first proper harvest. You climb down into the cellar, torch crackling in your hand. The air is thick, humid, and still. Rows of barrels stand like silent sentinels, sealed, untouched. You lift a lid. The grain inside is black with mold. A soft scurrying noise echoes from deeper in the dark. The food was here, still is, and it's rotting. Here's a quiet colonial tragedy. They stored food, but rarely checked on it. When you imagine famine, you probably picture empty shelves, gnawed bones, the total absence of anything edible. But in many cases, the early colonists weren't starving because they had nothing. They were starving because what they had spoiled. And no one noticed, or worse, no one dared say it out loud. This was especially true in winter. The cold pressed in, Firewood dwindled, and down in those cellars and storage rooms, food quietly surrendered to damp and darkness. Bins of flour turned blue. Dried meat grew soft and strange. Potatoes wept black ooze, and the colonists, too proud or too tired, simply avoided the problem. You can almost hear the excuses. We'll open that one next week. I'm sure the pickled fish is fine. It's only a little green. And the classic, it's not mold if you scrape it off. Historians still argue whether this widespread negligence came from poor leadership, lack of understanding, or just the sheer exhaustion of colonial life. The likely answer? All of the above. Life in a new land was relentless. You were building cabins, defending fences, tending fires, watching skies for storms. Food storage didn't feel urgent, until it did. Here's a fringe tidbit for you. Some colonists buried their food stores to keep them safe from thieves and animals, only to forget where they were. There are reports of men digging for hours in snowdrifts, trying to find a missing barrel of salted venison and never recovering it. The bear that did probably had a lovely winter. And it wasn't just mold. Bugs were everywhere. Weevils loved flour. Mice adored corn. Rats held entire diplomatic councils in the granaries. One settler wrote bitterly that his bread crunched even before the bite. That wasn't crust, that was infestation. And still they ate. Some tried to fight back. Colonists strung food from rafters, rubbed dried fish with extra salt, even tried coating meat in pine sap, a technique borrowed from local tribes but without their precision. The results? Somewhere between candle and jerky. Not delicious, but marginally chewable. Others just hoped the cold would preserve everything. But colonial winters were unreliable. A warm spell could undo a week's worth of ice storage in hours. And the moment moisture touched the grain, it was gone. Not gone in the sense of disappeared, gone in the sense of now smells like a haunted sponge. Some stored food in barrels without lids, assuming the tight stacking would protect it. This worked about as well as storing soup in a shoebox. One diary describes a fine cheddar consumed entirely by blue fuzz. The same entry ends with, "We tried to eat it anyway." Colonists also relied heavily on smokehouses, sheds where meat could hang, dry, and absorb preservation from smoldering fires. But if the wood was too green, or the fire too low, or the air too wet, the meat half-cooked instead of curing. Some ate it anyway. Others refused, sparking fights over whether it was tender or suspicious. One man allegedly tried to cook rotten meat back to safety by boiling it for 6 hours. He served it proudly. Half the colony spent the night vomiting. The other half swore they tasted just a hint of thyme. There was no thyme in it, probably just mold. Let's pause here. This wasn't just about storage, it was about silence. The colonists often knew their stores were spoiling, and said nothing, maybe out of shame, maybe because they didn't want to panic others, maybe because they feared the reaction. What if we really have nothing left? One story tells of a hidden crate of flour discovered in spring. Untouched since autumn, it had gone sour. No one knew who had stored it, or why they hadn't spoken up. By the time it was found, half the colony was already sick from eating moss cakes and boiled boots. And yet, there were flickers of wisdom. Some remembered to rotate food, like the old sailors did. Some checked barrels monthly, tasting for the turn. A few even learned from local tribes how to store maize in woven baskets coated in ash to keep bugs out. These moments mattered. They bought time. They saved lives. But for every careful hand, there were 10 more that just didn't look. They trusted the seller to guard their hope. But a cellar isn't a promise. It's a gamble. And without vigilance, it turns from pantry to grave. So when we think of those starving colonists, we picture them wrapped in rags holding empty bowls. But often the bowl was full of rot, of silence, of something that used to be edible. And they ate anyway, because what else could they do? You're handed a wooden bowl. Inside, a murky slurry that might once have been cornmeal. You count your blessings, at least it's something. Beside you, a man tips his bowl over and catches 3 beans and a twig. He laughs, but not with humor. It's ration time in the starving colony. and the only fair thing is how unfair it all feels. Welcome to the era of 1 cup per day, if you were lucky. Often it was less. In famine conditions, food wasn't just sustenance, it became currency, leverage, and a test of character. And rationing was never a clean process. It was built on shaky math, shifting loyalty, and the unspoken reality that someone wasn't going to eat. The idea was simple: divide what remains. The execution, a masterclass in anxiety. Rations were meted out by a handful of men, often under pressure, exhausted, and occasionally deeply corrupt. Your ration depended on your status, your connections, and how loudly you could insist you were working harder than the others. Historians still argue whether some rationing systems were structured or completely chaotic. Some colonies claimed to use strict ledgers, weighing out grain to the ounce. Others handed out meals by judgment, meaning, essentially, by vibe. Here's a particularly bleak fringe detail. In one settlement, the man in charge of doling out rations kept a secret stash of raisins under his cot. Raisins. He guarded them like gold. Someone eventually snitched. The raisins disappeared. So did the snitch. On paper, the average adult settler might receive something like a pint of wheat, a bit of salted meat, and a scoop of peas per day. But during crises, that dropped fast, sometimes to a half cup, sometimes to nothing, and that's when things got desperate and ugly. People lied for food, they forged notes from officers, they faked injuries. One man limped for 3 weeks to get extra grain, only to be caught sprinting after a rabbit. His punishment? Ration removed, irony achieved. Others turned to theft, quietly at first, a scoop here, a pinch there. Then the stores started locking, then guards were posted, then those guards started stealing too. And still, the rations trickled out. A scoop of sour grain, a biscuit you had to beat against a table, a mystery stew with nothing mysterious except how it still counted as food. Some colonists began to trade their rations, a few beans for firewood, a cup of cornmeal for a blanket. This created an invisible economy, the hungry selling tomorrow to survive today, a kind of nutritional payday loan that never quite worked out. There's a chilling story from Plymouth. A young boy traded away his entire week's ration for a flint, thinking he could use it to catch rabbits. He never caught a rabbit. He spent that week chewing on bark. And yet, amid all this, someone always ate better. The governor, the officers, the inner circle. In many colonies, leaders received double rations, allegedly for sustained duties. Conveniently, those duties included sleeping indoors and writing reports. One governor allegedly kept a personal barrel of ale hidden in his quarters, drinking each night while others boiled shoe leather. When called out, he insisted it was medicinal. His colony called it betrayal. Even the act of lining up for rations became a ritual of shame. You'd wait in line, bowl in hand, trying not to look at the person ahead of you, or the crumbs in their beard. You'd hope the scoop was full, that no one accused you of stealing, that you didn't drop it on the walk back. One woman did. Her meal landed in the mud. She sobbed. No one gave her theirs. They couldn't. And it wasn't just about food. It was about trust. Who got to decide how much was fair? Who got seconds? Who got nothing? That's where the hoarding started. People buried hardtack under their beds, tied dried beans into their clothes. One man was found to have hollowed out the heel of his boot to stash flour. It burst when he walked. He blamed the rats. Everyone knew better. And of course, some rations never made it to the ledger. Supplies went missing from the docks. A crate of peas vanished. A sack of onions rolled off the cart. Spoiler, it did not. You can almost hear the whispers. Don't trust James. She got extra again. I saw someone eating after dark. And sometimes, yes, there was compassion. A crust slipped quietly into a sick bed, a spoonful shared when no one was looking. But these moments were rare, because the truth was, generosity could kill you. You couldn't feed someone else and yourself, not for long. And so, the bowl became the symbol of the starving colonies, not just for what it held, but for what it didn't. Hope, fairness, dignity. And yet, you still lined up, still waited, still scraped the sides and counted the beans. because a cup a day was better than none, until it wasn't. You stare at a pile of kernels, smooth, golden, and meant for planting. They gleam like coins in your palm. But the frost came early, and your stomach clenches louder than your conscience. You toss a handful into the fire, grind some into mash, and tell yourself it's only a little. Just this once. This is how it starts. The seed corn disappears, and with it, the future. The colonists knew better. Everyone knew. Seed corn is sacred. It's what ensures the next harvest. It's the thin green thread that connects desperation now to survival later. But when winter bit down and the snow wouldn't melt, that thread snapped, quietly, bowl by bowl. Eating the seed corn wasn't just a tactical failure. It was a spiritual one. It meant the colony had given up on tomorrow. The practice didn't start out as a plan. It started as a whisper. A handful missing here, a small batch ground for a sick child. But soon, desperation gained momentum. Once one person did it, others followed. By the time anyone tried to stop it, the sacks were nearly empty, or already boiling on someone else's fire. One settler reportedly marked his seed sacks with a red X and buried them beneath his floorboards to protect them. His neighbor followed the tracks in the snow and dug them up. Later, the man claimed it was a matter of God's provision. He said this while chewing the evidence. Historians still argue whether eating the seed corn was an act of individual desperation or communal collapse. Likely, it was both, because once the idea takes root, once the colony agrees, even silently, that survival is worth sabotaging the future, everything else erodes with it. Here's a fringe tidbit. In one settlement, someone carved a sign and nailed it over the seed storeroom. It read, "Eat today, die tomorrow." When rations vanished, the sign was burned for firewood. The symbolism was not subtle. And yes, the colonists knew this was a line they shouldn't cross. That's what made it hurt. They weren't fools. They just couldn't bear another day of scraping tree bark into porridge. So they made choices, awful ones. And sometimes they told themselves it wasn't really seed corn. These were the extras. These weren't labeled. We can trade for more. But the lie always tasted the same. Warm for a moment, bitter for months. Because spring came, it always did, and when it did, the land stood waiting. But the sacks were bare. You can imagine the panic. They turned the storehouses upside down, checked under beds, behind barrels, found rat droppings, empty sacks, a single moldy cob someone had forgotten to eat. And the planting season passed by like a mist ship, visible then gone. Some tried to borrow from neighboring tribes, but relations were strained. Others hoped a supply ship would bring seeds. And when one finally did, they discovered it had carried wheat, not maize. A mismatched crop weeks too late. And so the colony sat there, tools in hand, fields tilled, with nothing to plant. It's one thing to be hungry, it's another to be hungry and helpless. The fallout wasn't immediate. It arrived in slow horror. People rationed even harder, hunted the woods bare, boiled more bark. Others simply left or died. And guilt grew alongside the hunger. People remembered who had eaten what. Whispers circled. One woman accused another of feeding her child 1,000 summers. Another man confessed on his deathbed that he'd stolen seed and planted none. There's a heartbreaking line in one settler's letter. "We took the future into our mouths and chewed it to paste." He meant it literally. And yet, not everyone fell to it. A few held out. One family buried a jar of corn so deep it froze. Come spring, they had just enough to plant half a field. They protected it with torches and sleepless nights. It sprouted, it grew, it saved them. But they were the exception. Most had nothing left to plant. And when harvest time came, the fields looked like a battlefield. Empty furrows, scattered weeds, a broken hoe half sunk in the mud. Somewhere a single stalk of corn stood, shriveled and alone, like it was trying to apologize. And this wasn't the last time. Colonies repeated the mistake. Again and again, it became a pattern. Not a failure of planning, but of panic. So next time someone says, "You reap what you sow," remember the settlers who sowed nothing, because they ate it first. And remember that hunger isn't always about food. Sometimes it's about fear. the kind that whispers, "Forget next year. You won't make it through tonight." You wake to shouting, not enemies, not wolves, just two men arguing over a shovel. One claims it's his turn to dig a waste trench. The other says he's in charge of the cornfield. You sit up, exhausted, and realize no one is making breakfast. Again. Because once the colony splinters, so does the pantry. When times get hard, humans get complicated, and nowhere was this truer than in the early colonial settlements, where food and power were so tangled they could bring down a whole community faster than frost. On paper, these colonies were unified, a single mission, one flag, shared rations. But in practice, the moment things got tough, unity cracked like stale hardtack. Factions formed, power struggles erupted, people divided themselves by class, loyalty, region, religion, and most of all, by who controlled the food. Historians still argue whether these breakdowns were inevitable or the result of poor leadership. The records are murky, self-serving, and usually written by whoever didn't starve. But the pattern is consistent. When everyone's hungry, nobody trusts anybody. Here's a fringe gem. In one early Virginia colony, two men started rival cooking fires, 10 feet apart. Both claimed to be the official stew master. They hoarded spices, accused each other of theft, and one eventually burned the other's soup pot in the night. Their shared garden was abandoned. That winter, the colony lost half its food supply, and still referred to it as the Great Broth War. But the tension wasn't just between individuals. Entire cliques formed. The gentry wanted control. The laborers demanded fairness. The soldiers argued they deserved more for defending the settlement. The clergy asked for extra bread to maintain strength for sermons. No one was thrilled. And all the while, the food sat waiting, rationed badly, mismanaged, and sometimes outright hidden. One colonial council tried to ease tensions by forming a food committee. It collapsed in 3 days. Too many demands, not enough biscuits. One member quit mid-meeting, shouting, "Let the carrots rot, I will not be insulted over a turnip." It would be funny if it weren't so fatal. Divisions meant duplicated efforts, wasted resources, and missed plannings. While one group was digging irrigation trenches, another was undoing them to build a livestock pen. While the farmers planned spring planting, the soldiers commandeered their seeds for emergency use. One year, 2 factions planted competing crops in the same field, corn and barley, and neither grew well. The soil was overworked, underwatered, and poisoned with rivalry. And then came the revenge meals. Yes, those were real. One cook, aligned with the officers, deliberately oversalted a stew meant for the lower-class laborers. They retaliated by dumping ash into the flour barrel. No one ate well that week. Everyone blamed everyone else. People stopped gathering at the communal table. They ate in corners, in silence, pretending their bites were larger than they were. Children learned not to ask for seconds. People pretended not to notice who had an extra crust tucked in their pocket. And worse, work stopped. Farming is a collective act. Planting, watering, harvesting, it takes hands. And when half those hands are arguing, the field lies fallow. It's hard to till the soil when you're accusing someone of stealing onions. One settler described the colony's mood as thin, not just the soup, the air, thin with suspicion, fraying like a bad rope. "We watched one another's mouths more than our own plates," he wrote. There's a heartbreaking moment in a 1622 letter where a woman writes, "We have 10 pounds of wheat, yet no bread, for the miller will not grind for the governor, and the cook will not knead for the preacher." 10 pounds, enough to feed them all, and no one could agree what to do with it. This wasn't just dysfunction, it was collapse. And once the arguments began, food became both weapon and shield. Eat with us or starve. Plant our way or dig your own grave. Lines drawn in the dirt, not with swords, but with spoons. Even those who tried to broker peace found themselves isolated. One man who offered to mediate ration shares was accused of conspiring with both sides. His stew was stolen. He left the colony a week later. No one followed. And the worst part? When famine truly hit, those divisions hardened instead of healing. People didn't suddenly band together like a movie montage. They dug in, formed tighter circles, blamed the other group for eating too much, planting too little, hoarding what should have been shared. The colony had food, but not a colony. Because a divided settlement is more than inefficient, it's dangerous. You stop trusting the guards, you stop attending councils, you stop telling people where the extra corn is buried. And when spring comes and planting begins and no one volunteers to work together, the hunger loops right back. So the next time someone says starvation was just about weather or crops or rats, remember this. It was also about pride, pettiness, and the way a single sour argument can leave 20 mouths empty. Because a colony divided doesn't just fall, it forgets how to feed itself. You sit near the dying fire, bowl in hand, watching the governor eat from a separate pot, thicker, richer, and steaming, with something you haven't tasted in weeks, meat. You're told he needs it to keep his strength. You wonder what that makes you. In the colonies, food wasn't just survival, it was status, and those at the top rarely starved like the rest. This was a brutal, quiet truth behind the famine. The leaders ate first. Officially, many colonial settlements had rules about equal rationing, noble-sounding declarations like all shall share alike in lean times. But reality, as usual, had different ideas, because when food grew scarce, fairness slipped quietly out the back door, and hierarchy sat down to dinner. It wasn't always overt. Sometimes it was phrased gently. The captain needs extra calories to patrol. The council must be fed to govern. The preacher must be nourished to pray for us all. But the result was the same. The stew ladle always dipped deeper into the bowl when it faced upward. Historians still argue whether these uneven rations were a necessary evil, or a betrayal of the social contract. Probably both. But what's clear is that in many colonies, leaders had private stores, secret sacks of flour, special meat rations, and in some cases, entire barrels hidden under floorboards. Here's a fringe nugget for you. In one colony, the quartermaster was caught salting away extra fish under his mattress, not metaphorically, literally under his mattress. He claimed it was to ward off rats. It didn't, but it did ward off everyone else. The smell alone was legendary. There's a record from Jamestown describing how the leadership kept a gentleman's table, even during the starving time. Candles, napkins, dishes arranged like it was still England. Meanwhile, laborers ate gruel off wooden slabs, and by gruel, we mean thin water and hope. The psychological toll was just as damaging as the hunger itself. Imagine watching a councilman's children nibble honey bread while your own kid chews pine bark. Imagine being told there's no more meat, then hearing bones crack in the governor's chamber. You might try to believe the excuses. It's just medicine, just for the sick, just this once. But the pattern repeated, winter after winter, colony after colony. Those with titles and locked doors found ways to keep eating. And it broke something, not just bodies, but trust. One of the most whispered accusations in colonial records wasn't murder or theft, it was favoritism, the belief that certain families received more, that one man's wife always had onions, that another's boots were too new for someone supposedly starving. And where trust breaks, rage follows. One winter, a cook was dragged from the storeroom and accused of hiding sugar for the officers. She was beaten, then released, then vanished into the forest days later. No one recorded what became of her. Her name doesn't survive, but someone drew a sugar loaf in the margins of that week's journal, half erased. Even when food was rationed equally on paper, enforcement was another matter. Some guards looked the other way. Others accepted bribes, a blanket, a favor, a necklace passed in the dark. A system built on fairness became a marketplace of desperation. And yet, here's where it gets strange. Some leaders believed they were entitled, genuinely. They thought their decisions were heavier, their roles more demanding, that their hunger was somehow more valid. One governor famously said, "A starving general is a dead battalion." His men did not agree. There's an eerie entry in a 1624 ledger. The captain dined well today. His spirits restored. The common pot yielded only broth. The tone is so casual it chills. It wasn't always about greed. Sometimes it was just the math. A leader with access could sneak an extra handful. A clerk in the food tent could quietly label a half-empty sack, spoiled, then take it home. One settler told of a man who brought his own spoon to dinner, carved from whalebone. He ate faster than the others, she wrote. He always had more. That spoon was later stolen, then returned, snapped in half. And of course, when spring returned and food flowed again, the lines blurred. Forgiveness came fast. It was a hard winter. We did what we had to, but no one forgot. The people remembered who had eaten seconds. They remembered who got meat, who got fat, who never looked tired. And they remembered sitting in silence, staring into their bowls while someone else chewed. So the next time you picture early colonial hardship, don't imagine a community locked arm in arm, sharing every crumb. Sometimes they did, but just as often one man sat full, while 10 others stared. You lean over the well, rope creaking in your hands. The bucket descends into darkness. Cool air rises to your face. Water, finally. You haul it up, lips cracked, throat like dust. You drink, it tastes like metal, then sulfur, then something far worse. Within hours, your stomach twists. By morning, half the colony is sick. The river was poison, the well was worse. In the mythology of colonial suffering, food gets all the attention. The missing harvest, the eaten seed corn, the spoiled barrels. But what killed just as many, and often did it faster, was water. Because when you're starving, you'll eat almost anything, but when you're thirsty, you'll drink everything. And in the early settlements, everything meant brackish rivers, shallow wells, and rain barrels filled with dead bugs. The result? Dysentery, typhoid, cholera, diarrhea so violent it became its own kind of starvation. You could be holding a bowl of stew and still die of thirst, or worse, you could be dying from the water in the stew. Historians still argue how many colonists were lost to tainted water versus actual famine. But some estimates suggest waterborne illness was the primary killer during the worst winters. Food didn't need to run out. You just needed one bad cup. Here's a fringe detail no one wants to picture at dinner. Some colonists used river water to mix flour, then couldn't figure out why the bread made everyone collapse. It was cursed, one diary says. We boiled it thrice, and still the spirits raged in the gut. Those spirits were bacteria, but the concept wasn't wrong. The rivers near Jamestown, for instance, were tidal. That meant the water looked fresh but was often salty and full of waste. Waste from settlers, animals, and occasionally corpses. The colonists didn't understand how tides worked. They drank deeply. One account describes clear, cold water that smelt of fish. Later, it smelled of decay. By spring, the river was blamed for more deaths than the food shortage. And so they dug wells. But digging a good well is science. It requires depth, placement, and filtration. The early settlers had none of this. They dug shallow pits in soft soil, sometimes too close to latrines or burial grounds. The results? Wells that were fast to fill and faster to infect. One tragic example comes from the Popham colony, where a single contaminated well reportedly wiped out a third of the settlement in under a month. Their spring of hope became known in letters home as the Devil's Teacup. And even rainwater wasn't safe. Colonists collected it in open barrels, then forgot to cover them. Leaves fell in, birds bathed, mosquitoes swarmed. One man swore he found a frog in his bucket and drank around it. Another tried to purify water by stirring it with a hot poker. This resulted in warm, brown water and third-degree burns. He died the next day, possibly from the water, possibly from pride. Some tribes offered guidance. They showed how to find clean springs, how to boil and strain, how to use certain roots to neutralize toxins. But these lessons were rarely written down, often ignored, sometimes mocked. Because it wasn't just a failure of science, it was a failure of humility. The colonists thought they knew water. They'd come from countries with cisterns, wells, pumps, but this was a new world, with different soil, different parasites, different rules, and the water didn't care about their assumptions. There's a particularly grim moment in one settler's journal. We drew water from the earth, and the earth did curse us back. Poetic, also accurate. And yet, they had no choice. They couldn't not drink, So they rationed clean water like gold, a ladle per person, a sip at night. The sick received extra. The rest learned to chew snow or suck on stones. Some tried to flavor the water, with berries, with herbs, even with molasses. It didn't work. Mold grew faster. One man added vinegar. He called it purified. Everyone else called it soup of despair. And through it all, they kept drinking, because thirst waits for nothing. It doesn't care about logic or warnings or even memory. When your tongue is dry enough, even poison seems like mercy. So yes, they starved, but they also dehydrated rapidly, quietly, fatally. Their bodies shrank, their lips cracked, their minds unraveled, and they kept drawing water, because what else could they do? They drank from death and called it providence. You lie on your back in the cabin, staring at the rafters. No wind, no footsteps, just a silence so heavy it feels like a second blanket. You haven't spoken in days. No one has. The others sit by the fire, stirring ashes that used to be dinner. No one is crying anymore, not even the children. That's how you know it's bad. Because starvation doesn't begin in the stomach, it begins in the spirit. The colonists learned this too late. Hunger is physical, yes, bones thinning, cheeks hollowing, strength fading. But the real killer? The slow, invisible rot of hopelessness. It wasn't just that they ran out of food, it's that they ran out of reasons to look for it. This is what historians rarely teach. Famine breaks the mind before the body. It starts with fatigue. You stop checking traps, you ignore the berry bushes, you sit instead of forage. Then comes suspicion. You stop trusting your neighbor, you hide what little you have, you pretend you're fine while dreaming about tree bark. Eventually, the apathy arrives. That's the scariest part. Not the hunger pains, but when the pain stops, when your stomach forgets how to feel, when you sleep more than you're awake, when you can smell stew from another hut and feel nothing. And that wasn't a few settlers, that was entire colonies. Historians still argue whether some of the worst colonial die-offs were due more to psychological collapse than physical deprivation. The records hint at it. Entries grow sparse, language becomes dry, minimal, flat, like the people writing them were already ghosts. One fringe account from Roanoke, yes, that Roanoke, suggests the final settlers stopped even trying to signal ships. They did not light the fires. It reads, they sat in shadow and made no motion. That might be legend, or it might be the truest thing in the archive. Because when you believe no one's coming, when you believe nothing will ever grow again, why keep planning? There's an entry from a Jamestown survivor who wrote, "Today we had broth. It was only hot water, but we did call it broth for the comfort of saying so. It's a line you can feel in your ribs. Food becomes memory. Naming becomes a kind of survival." Some colonists tried to fight the despair with rituals. One group made a practice of pretending each meal was a feast. They'd describe roast meats and sugared fruits while chewing boiled weeds. For a while, it worked. Then one of them went blind from malnutrition. The game ended. Others turned to faith or superstition. Some believed famine was divine punishment. Others blamed witches, weather spirits, or cursed soil. There are records of colonists burying silver under trees to awaken the harvest gods. The only thing they awakened were confused squirrels. And yet, the fear wasn't just spiritual, it was social. When you're starving, everyone looks dangerous. You start watching who's losing weight and who's not. You start noticing who has energy and who's faking it. You start whispering about the ones who don't seem hungry at all. That's when things turn. One colonist accused his own brother of hiding flour. Another swore a widow had traded favors for venison. Whether true or not didn't matter. What mattered was the suspicion, that poisonous little thought, I am hungry because someone else is full. And when that seed takes root, unity dies. Cabins became fortresses, meals were eaten in corners, the fires dimmed and silence deepened. Not because there was nothing to say, but because hope makes noise, and there was none left. Some settlers tried to escape it by going into the woods alone. A few came back with food, most didn't come back at all. One woman left with her 2 sons to search for chestnuts. Only the younger boy returned days later, carrying nothing but his mother's shawl. No one asked questions. And yet, even in the bleakest moments, small sparks of will survived. A boy shared a single biscuit with his sister and told her it would grow back. A man carved birds into the walls so they could pretend they'd eaten fowl. A woman boiled grass and called it a new recipe. Green broth, she whispered. It tasted like tears. Because starvation isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet, a slow fading, a dimming of eyes, a soft sigh in the dark. It's the moment you forget why you ever expected food in the first place. So the next time someone tells you the colonists starved because they were lazy or foolish or poorly supplied, remember this. They also starved because they stopped believing they could survive. And once that thought sets in, you're already halfway gone. You kneel beside a patch of green. It looks like spinach, sort of. You sniff it, sharp, bitter. But maybe that's good. You chew a leaf. Your tongue tingles, your throat tightens. Someone calls your name, but it's already too late. Because sometimes the thing that looks like salvation is just another predator. Among all the reasons the colonists starved, here's one that rarely makes the textbook cut. They ate what killed them. Hunger makes you reckless. It blurs the lines between edible and toxic, between caution and desperation. The settlers weren't poisoned by some grand conspiracy. They were poisoned by guesswork. The woods were full of options, but the problem wasn't scarcity, it was identification. And the difference between a meal and a eulogy often came down to the shape of a leaf or the color of a stem. Historians still argue how many settlers died from misidentifying plants. The records are vague. Deaths were often labeled simply of flux, of the belly, or of God's will. But between the symptoms, vomiting, hallucinations, paralysis, a clearer pattern emerges. The colonists were foraging in a forest they didn't understand. They mistook deadly nightshade for berries, bit into water hemlock, thinking it was wild carrot, brewed tea from plants that numbed their tongues and silenced their lungs. Here's a fringe tidbit for you. One settler journal mentions a salad of noble color, much like cress, though it did leave my hands a shade of blue. 3 people ate it, none survived. The entry ends abruptly, like the salad. And mushrooms? Oh, mushrooms were a minefield. Even today, with apps and field guides, mushroom hunting is risky. Back then, it was like culinary Russian roulette. The colonists knew some fungi were edible, but which? One group boiled what they thought were puffballs. They foamed. One man called them angel clouds. The next morning, half the camp was convulsing. Still, the hunger pressed them on. They tried to tame wild roots. Some were safe, like burdock or cattail. Others were only edible if cooked a specific way, in a specific season. The colonists didn't know that. They threw them into stews and hoped for the best. One woman boiled a batch of wild parsnips. She fed them to her children. Hours later, only one child was still awake. She buried the rest in silence. Her next journal entry simply read, "The garden lies silent." It wasn't just plants. Animals posed their own risks. Colonists hunted creatures they'd never seen before. Snakes, opossums, snapping turtles. Some were fine, some weren't. One settler tried roasting a skunk. He claimed it was surprisingly tender. His neighbors claimed it made them see visions. The truth is unclear. Another account describes colonists boiling toads. For broth, it reads, "The taste was sharp and our dreams unsettled." You don't need a degree in toxicology to guess how that turned out. And sometimes the danger was subtle, slow, a buildup of toxins over days or weeks. Lead cooking pots leached poison. Improperly stored beans released lectins. A batch of rye infested with a certain mold caused hallucinations and convulsions. Symptoms now associated with ergot poisoning, the same culprit often blamed for the Salem witch trials. But no one in the colonies knew these words. They just knew pain and confusion and loss. And when the deaths came, they didn't always come cleanly. Some sickened over days, wasting away. Others died mid-meal. Still others lingered in fever dreams, whispering apologies to the forest. And yet, the colonists kept eating. Because they had no choice. No field guides, no mentors, just guesswork and desperation. Sometimes they watched animals. If a bird ate a berry and lived, they figured it was safe. But birds don't digest like humans. And squirrels? Immune to half the toxins that would drop a grown man. Trusting them was like watching a raccoon and deciding to lick a garbage bag. Even when local tribes tried to help, to point out what was safe, pride often got in the way. "We do not eat the savage's weeds," one leader wrote. That weed, it turns out, was dandelion, rich in iron, vitamin C, and survival. Eventually, some colonists learned, painfully. They mapped safe plants, swapped stories of near deaths, compared leaf shapes with shaky hands, and slowly a fragile knowledge base grew. But for many, the cost had already been paid. So yes, they were surrounded by food, but they didn't know which bite would save them, and which one would bury them. You squint through the smoke as someone fans the fire with their hat. The room is dark, choking, and no one seems to know why. The stew won't boil, the chimney won't draw. The fire burns, but the food stays raw. And the people? They cough and curse and wonder what they did wrong. They cooked, but didn't understand fire. It sounds ridiculous, doesn't it? How can a colony fail at something so basic? But the truth is, the early settlers knew how to make fire. They just didn't know how to live with it, especially not in houses that smoked like chimneys and chimneys that worked like traps. Cooking, for the colonists, wasn't just about skill. It was about engineering. Bad fireplaces meant undercooked food. Wet wood meant choking flames. And the settlers, fresh from England's stone hearths, weren't ready for America's timber-framed chaos. Most cabins had open hearths, simple stone or mud structures meant to direct smoke upward. But materials were scarce, time was short, corners were cut, chimneys collapsed or leaned at odd angles. Some weren't chimneys at all, just holes in the roof. You can imagine how that went in a thunderstorm. And so, the food suffered. Bread never browned, stew never thickened, meat smoked for days and still stayed pink. One colonist complained his beef smelt of soot and shrieked upon the tongue. That's not a flavor profile, that's a warning label. Historians still argue whether the issue was poor construction or pure inexperience. Probably both. Many colonists were former city dwellers who'd never built a fire outside a tavern. They expected kitchens to work like they did back home, without realizing the chimney needed cleaning, the wood needed seasoning, the fire needed respect. Here's a fringe anecdote for you. One settler tried to dry wood by putting it on top of the fire. It caught, as you might guess. The fire spread, the stew survived, the cabin didn't. Another group, thinking they'd outsmart the smoke, dug a fire pit in the middle of the room. No ventilation, no flue. By morning, they'd nearly asphyxiated themselves. One man insisted the experience opened his lungs. Everyone else coughed for a week. And that's the thing. The fire didn't just fail to cook, it actively made things worse. It blackened the walls, it soaked food in creosote, it coated meat in bitterness and lungs in phlegm. There are letters filled with despair over dinners that burn on the bottom and freeze on the top, over breads that rise not but sulk. One woman wrote, "I do cook with hope, and yet hope alone remains hot." Even when the flames behaved, the tools didn't help. Pots were crude, often cast iron or copper, but sometimes just repurposed buckets or thin metal bowls. Lids were rare, tripods wobbled, hanging chains snapped. It wasn't unusual for a stew to tip into the fire halfway through dinner. And don't forget the weather. Rain soaked firewood, snow clogged chimneys. One storm iced over the entire hearth, sealing the flue and sending smoke spiraling into the rafters. The family inside moved outdoors to escape the fumes, and promptly froze half to death. You might think they'd eat cold meals instead, but even that was risky. Without proper storage, uncooked food turned toxic fast. Bread molded, beans fermented, salted meat melted into goo. So back to the fire they went, hacking, coaxing, cursing it to life. And fire wasn't just a cooking tool, it was a timekeeper. Breakfast had to start early, hours of tending before the coals were ready. One colonist estimated it took 4 hours to make morning gruel. By then, it was almost lunchtime. Dinner? A gamble. If you waited too long, the sun dipped and you lost both light and warmth. Then you had to decide, cook in the dark or chew in silence. There's a report of one family who gave up entirely. They ate only cold cornmeal soaked in rainwater. "We save fire for night," they wrote. "It is better for warmth than stew." And that, right there, is the heart of the failure. They weren't just cold, they were choosing warmth over food, heat over hunger, because they couldn't manage both. Some tried innovation, clay ovens, dugout stoves. One man built a smoke-reversing hearth. It smoked twice as much. Eventually, as the colony stabilized, better designs arrived, drafts improved, chimneys rose straighter, fireplaces stopped choking. But by then, entire winters had passed in the haze of half-cooked meals and smoke-blind eyes. So yes, they starved, not for lack of flame, but because the flame, mismanaged, turned the kitchen into a battlefield, where food went to blacken, and hope too often went up in smoke. You walk past the old storehouse, its door ajar. Inside, bones, cleaned, stacked, not animal, not exactly. You don't speak, no one does. The air has changed, everyone knows what happened that winter, but no one has the stomach to say it aloud. Because there are some hungers so deep, they take more than food to fill. They take the silence of a community and crack it wide open. This is the story they whisper, the one they hide under dry words like extreme necessity. But the truth is simple and terrible. During the starving time, they ate each other. Yes, that happened. In Jamestown, in the long winter of 1609 to 1610, in the space between desperation and oblivion, the line finally broke. Historians still argue whether it was widespread or isolated, a single horrific act or a quiet growing pattern. What they don't argue anymore is if. The evidence is there, bones with butchering marks, skulls split to reach the brain, joints dismembered with practiced hands. For centuries, it was just a rumor, something uncomfortable passed over in footnotes. But in 2013, a team of archaeologists uncovered a skeleton in a Jamestown trash pit. A girl, around 14, they called her Jane. Cut marks along her jaw, her shin, the back of her skull. Deliberate, clean. Starvation had a new face. And here's the most chilling part. The cut marks showed hesitation at first, then precision. Someone had never done this before. But then, they did. The letters from that winter are sparse, but one reads, "And now of late, not only fish and fowl, vermin and reptiles, but this unnatural food of man hath been seen among us." Unnatural, and yet not unexpected, because by that point they'd eaten everything else. Dogs, horses, rats, leather, bark, shoe soles, soup made from boiled hooves and bones. The seed corn was gone, the fields were dust, the river was sludge. What's left when nothing else remains? Some claimed it was the dead, already perished, others weren't so sure. Rumors of murder surfaced, of men who helped others die, quietly, efficiently, the kind of horror that doesn't scream, it just watches. One man was hanged for killing and eating his wife. The records state he was hanged for secret slaughter. No trial transcript, no testimony, just a single sentence like the dirt was too heavy to lift. And still, they survived. Because that's the bitter truth. Sometimes survival doesn't look noble. It looks like the unthinkable. Here's a fringe detail that feels almost cruel. While some were doing this, making soup from human bones, others just miles away weren't starving. A small outpost, better supplied, better led, they weathered the same winter, and they buried no one face down. Which makes the story of Jamestown not just about hunger, but about isolation. What happens when a colony is cut off, not just from food, but from help? What choices do you make when rescue isn't coming? Silence, mostly. That's what came next. No monuments, no confessions. Just graves and shame. The survivors didn't speak of it. And when the next ship arrived, bringing food and reinforcements, the dead were already buried. The bones hidden, the cookpots scrubbed, the horror folded into memory. Later, the colony flourished. Jamestown became a capital. Virginia thrived. But beneath the foundations, something old and terrible still lingers. Because once you've done the unthinkable, it becomes part of the soil, part of the story, part of the price. And yet, there's something more painful than the act itself. It's the need. That kind of hunger doesn't just hollow your belly. It hollows you. What you believe, what you think you'd never do. The colonists didn't wake up monsters. They woke up human. And in the cold silence of that winter, that was enough. You wander beyond the stockade, past the blackened stumps and dead brush, following a trail of cracked nuts and bird droppings. You're looking for something, anything, and then you see it. A wild pear tree, branches heavy, fruit soft with ripeness. There's a hush to it, like a secret the land has kept too long. Because here's the bitter truth. They were surrounded by food. And they didn't eat it. In their hunger, the colonists passed orchards. They stepped over berry thickets. They ignored hazelnuts falling at their feet. The trees swayed with forgotten gifts, and the colonists trudged by, blind to the feast. Why? Historians still argue. Some say ignorance, some say fear. Others, and this is the hard part, say pride. Because much of the wild food wasn't actually wild. It was cultivated by indigenous hands over generations. Food forests, carefully planted, nut groves arranged by soil and sun, fruit trees pruned, trained, placed. This wasn't random, this was intentional. A landscape shaped by knowledge the colonists didn't understand and didn't think to ask about. They saw the bounty, but they didn't see the intelligence behind it. To them, a fruit tree without a fence was wild. A berry bush without rows was disorderly. A grove of chestnuts was just the woods. And so they overlooked what didn't match their expectations of what a farm should be. It's like walking through a banquet and refusing to eat because the napkins aren't folded. There's a particularly haunting line in a settler's letter. We passed many trees that bore fruit of unknown origin. The deer fed well. That deer, by the way, they hunted it, ate it, but not the tree it stood under. Here's a fringe tidbit. Archaeologists found evidence near Roanoke of large, cultivated mulberry and persimmon groves, untouched by settlers, and nearby, journals describing colonists chewing on leather. The mulberries apparently didn't meet European sweetness standards. The issue wasn't just flavor, it was familiarity. They trusted wheat, they trusted apples, English ones. Anything else? Suspicious, possibly cursed, probably dangerous, even if the local tribes were happily munching away on the same berries. And then there was ownership. Many settlers believed that if something wasn't fenced, it wasn't theirs to eat. They feared stealing from the forest, even though the tribes viewed food as communal, a gift from the land, not a product, but a process, a relationship. The colonists had no word for that. They had property lines. There's an eerie moment recorded in a sermon from the Plymouth colony. Let us not eat of the land unearned, lest it turn bitter in the gut. Translation: if you didn't plant it, you shouldn't trust it. Of course, some colonists did eat wild, the desperate, the curious, the observant, a woman who made acorn bread after watching squirrels, a man who gathered black walnuts for his children, a boy who tracked bees to a honey tree. These were small victories, uncelebrated, undocumented, because they didn't fit the colonial narrative of conquest. And sometimes, even when they did try, they did it wrong. They ate unripe fruit and got sick. They misidentified hazelnuts and cracked teeth on shells. One settler tried to roast wild grapes over fire. They exploded. He screamed. Everyone laughed and went back to boiled roots. But the land was generous, if you knew how to look. There were cattails, edible from root to tip, hickory nuts, calorie-rich and abundant, wild onions, wild garlic, chicory, sorrel, lamb's quarters. Even dandelions, hated in lawns today, were once a medicine, a tea, a salad. The tribes knew. They harvested without destroying, planted without rows. Their abundance didn't come from domination, but balance. The colonists didn't see it, didn't want to, because that would mean admitting someone else knew better. And so the forest stayed full, of food, of answers, of silence. while inside the palisade, the people wasted away. Not from lack, but from blindness. You stand on a hill, sun warming your back, and below you stretches something rare in colonial America, a thriving field, rows of corn, fat and green, squash vines coiled like lazy serpents, beans clinging to stalks like old friends. You hear laughter, the clatter of tools, and something else, chewing. Because not all the colonies starved. Some, a few, a stubborn few, beat the odds. They figured it out. They listened, they learned, they let go of pride just long enough to survive. This isn't a romantic fantasy. It didn't happen often, but when it did, it looked like cooperation, like adaptation, like humility served with cornbread and gratitude. One of the earliest examples, the Wampanoag and the Plymouth settlers. Yes, it's been smoothed over in Thanksgiving folklore, but behind the mythology is a real, gritty story of survival. The Wampanoag didn't just show up with a turkey and smiles, they taught. They walked the settlers through the woods, pointed at roots, corrected their planting methods. They showed them how to use fish as fertilizer, how to rotate crops, how to read the land like a storybook instead of a threat. And the settlers? For once, they listened. Historians still debate why this colony succeeded when others failed. Some say it was better timing, others say better weather, but most agree they accepted help and didn't turn it into war. Compare that to Jamestown, where nearly every peaceful exchange ended in suspicion or violence, where pride killed more crops than drought ever could. Here's a fringe tidbit. A little-known colony in Maine, the Sagadahoc settlement, brought more craftsmen than noblemen. They focused on building infrastructure, not searching for gold. It didn't last long. Winter was brutal. But while it stood, it functioned because they brought the right people. Another lesser-known success story, the Moravians in Pennsylvania. These were deeply communal settlers. They planned, they shared food, they stored wisely, they planted crops meant for the land, not just their nostalgia. And crucially, they didn't treat the woods like an enemy. They adapted their diets using berries, nuts, and game they'd never seen before. One account even describes a settler making blackberry wine in modest joy, a moment of human sweetness in a world that had mostly tasted like ash. And then there were the Acadians in the Northeast, isolated, resourceful, patient. They learned to trap, to preserve, to smoke fish correctly. Their starvation rates were lower because they invested in knowledge instead of illusion. And almost every successful colony had one thing in common. They brought women. This matters more than most history books admit. Women meant gardens, meant domestic knowledge, meant the preservation of food through drying, pickling, salting. In colonies that included families, not just restless men with swords and entitlement, food stability went up dramatically. Because women, historically, have known how to make little go far. And some colonies brought diverse people, not just upper-class Englishmen, but Germans, Dutch, French, farmers, brewers, bakers, people who came not to conquer, but to build, people who didn't laugh at strange plants, they tasted them. Some brought actual farmers, imagine that. A shocking innovation. And it worked. They didn't look for gold, they looked for soil. And when they found it, they got to work. They didn't expect the land to behave like England. They asked, what grows here? And let go of what didn't. And when they built their storehouses, they checked them. When they made their fires, they tended them. When they planted their seed corn, they didn't eat it in January. It wasn't perfection. There were still setbacks, failed crops, early frosts. But the difference? They learned, they adapted. They didn't let pride starve them to death. They weren't the loudest. Their names didn't always end up in monuments. But they left behind something louder than history books. Generations. So yes, most colonies failed. But some didn't. And those that lived, they didn't just change the land. They let the land change them. You sit by the fire, warm bread in your hand, and you think, this didn't have to happen this way. The smoke curls gently. The stew simmers without bitterness. The air is thick with time and something else. Understanding, but you remember what it cost to get here. Because the truth is this, They didn't just starve, they chose to. Not all at once, not in a dramatic, noble sacrifice, but in slow, steady choices, thousands of them, that built a wall between life and survival. They chose pride over learning, tradition over adaptation, power over sharing, fear over humility. They weren't doomed by nature, they were doomed by assumptions. Assumptions that wheat would grow like it did back home, that rivers would behave, that fish were strange, that berries were dangerous, that help from savages came with strings, that they knew better. Historians still argue about causes. Yes, the environment was harsh. Yes, supply ships were late. Yes, disease played its part. But at the core of every story is a human heart that said, "No, I'll do it my way." And the land replied, "Okay, but it's going to hurt." Let's rewind. They brought food, tools, dreams, a vision of paradise in their own image, but not the humility to learn, not the resilience to adapt, not the patience to listen. They landed in a continent that fed millions before them, and they starved. It wasn't about hunger, it was about mindset. Here's a fringe tidbit. In one forgotten settlement, someone carved a motto over the grain storehouse: "We do not break, for we are English." Months later, the building collapsed. The irony, like the roof, was not subtle. They brought iron, they needed wisdom. They brought armor, they needed humility. They brought a blueprint for conquest, to a land that required relationship. And it showed. Every full plate left to rot, every stew that went untouched out of superstition, every field ignored because it grew the wrong things, every hand refused until it vanished. They didn't just starve for calories. They starved for connection, to the land, to one another, to the knowledge that survival isn't won by dominance, but by cooperation. Because food isn't just about eating, it's about noticing, tasting, trusting, learning that the purple root might save you, that the old woman by the river knows more than your captain, that a squirrel may be small, but it can get you through winter. And sometimes, yes, they did learn, but always too late. After the bark soup, after the leather stew, after the silence. And by then, the harvest was bones. So, as you drift into sleep tonight, remember, they didn't starve because the land was cruel. They starved because they thought they were above it. They chose pride over adaptation. And the land does not reward pride. It rewards respect. The fire has burned low now. The shadows no longer lurch across the walls. They settle, gently, like heavy wool blankets pulled over a restless body. Outside, the night breathes slow. Inside, you do too. There's no more scraping of bowls, no more footsteps in the snow, just the quiet crackle of embers and memory. Because the story is over, the hunger is not. You've walked alongside them, these settlers who came so far, with full ships and empty insight. You felt the gnawing in their bellies, the weight in their silence, the frost on their fingers as they passed up an orchard for an argument. You've watched them choose fear, choose control, choose to go hungry, with food all around. And now, it's quiet. Let it be. You are safe. You are warm. You are fed. You are not in a cabin filled with smoke. You are not scraping moss from stone. You are not wondering if tonight's stew will betray you. You are here in the hush that follows history, and that hush matters. Because this story isn't just about what they lost. It's about what we remember. That survival is not a single act. It is a posture, a willingness, a pause before the bite to ask, where did this come from? And a whisper after, what will I leave behind? So rest easy now. The past cannot hurt you. Let the wind carry away their regret. Let the frost melt off their legacy. Let the lesson remain, not as a warning, but as a kindness. Eat what is offered. Learn what is given. Stay curious. Stay humble. Stay full. Sleep now with full knowledge and an empty fear. The door is closed, the stew is warm, the fire is low. The story is told.